Iraq security forces announced the start of a new operation to retake the country's western province of Anbar. Tehran and the P5+1 group inch closer towards a historic agreement, with Iran's foreign minister expressing optimism over a nuclear deal by Tuesday. And health services across Yemen are collapsing amid a relentless Saudi bombing campaign. Hello there, just past midnight in the Iraqi capital, Baghdad, and you're watching Al-Etejad English News. Our top story tonight takes us to Iraq, where the army, backed by the country's volunteer groups, has launched a massive operation to liberate Iraq's largest province of Anbar from the Daesh terror group. The offensive is being launched from 3 different directions across Anbar, which sits in western Iraq. The focus is centered on recapturing the city of Fallujah, which lies only 50 kilometers from the capital, Baghdad. As ground forces surround the militant-held city of the Iraqi fighter jets have already begun bombarding Daesh positions inside Fallujah. This is the second time the Iraqi army has launched such an operation since Daesh seized Anbar's provincial capital, Ramadi, nearly 2 months ago.
Our armed forces, the Popular Mobilization Unit, Special Forces, Federal Police and Anbar's tribes are carrying out liberation operations and are advancing towards defined targets, and we will announce details later, one by one.
And staying in Iraq, where the Daesh terror group has claimed responsibility for a deadly series of bombings which killed nearly 40 people across Baghdad on Sunday. Just hours before the Iraqi government announced that operation to liberate Anbar province, the militant group launched a wave of bloody attacks against the Iraqi capital. One of the 6 deadly attacks took place in Aden Square. That's in close proximity to the holy shrine of Imam Musa al-Kadhim, the 7th Shia Imam. Well, at least 15,000 civilians have been killed and twice as many have been wounded in Iraq since the start of 2014. A new United Nations report dubbed Protection of Civilians in the Armed Conflict in Iraq reveals that there have been at least 44,136 civilian casualties in a little over a year. The report, which runs up to the end of April of 2015, acknowledged that the real toll could be much higher than that. The overwhelming majority of the deaths have been blamed on the onslaught launched by the Daesh terror group in the summer of last year. Well, next door is Syria. The army, backed by fighters from the Lebanese resistance movement Hezbollah, is advancing on 2 fronts. Syrian troops are now said to be just 5 kilometers away from Palmyra in the central province of Homs. Army units have already taken control of strategic hills west of the ancient city, which was occupied by Daesh back in May. Elsewhere in western Kalamoun province, the Syrian army and Hezbollah fighters began entering the last militant urban stronghold in that region. The joint force has seized control of a neighborhood southeast of Zabadani and cut off the main entrance to that border town. Negotiations in Vienna are continuing as Iran and the P5+1 group inch closer towards a historic nuclear agreement. Now, there's no deal yet, but Iran's foreign minister, Mohammad Javad Zarif, said that a nuclear deal is possible on Tuesday and the talks can continue as long as necessary. The White House, for its part, announced that the interim deal reached in November of 2013 will be extended if the negotiations continue.
The President has directed his team to remain engaged and participate in conversations as long as those conversations remain useful. And given the progress that's been made and given the success they've had in closing out some key issues, that's an indication that...
It took 17 straight days of intense negotiations to get Iran's top diplomat to say he is sleepy and overworked. Mohammad Javad Zarif has made it a daily habit of briefing anxious reporters on the latest updates of the nuclear talks from his balcony. But until now, he hasn't given them the answer they are looking for. And it looks like Zarif is not the only one who is tired of the protracted talks.
China believes that no agreement could be perfect, and conditions are already in place for us to reach a good agreement. Hence, foreign ministers of the 6 countries are gathered once again in Vienna to bring the negotiation to its conclusion. We believe that there cannot and should not be further delays in the negotiations.
A breakthrough agreement is not entirely out of reach, as progress has been made between Iran and the 6 major powers.
The talks are in the last gasp stage. There has been very good progress over the past 2 or 3 days, but of course there are still some issues that need to be resolved, and we can't reach a full agreement until this has been achieved.
The latest coming out of these closed-door, high-profile meetings is that both sides have agreed to partially lift an arms embargo on Iran, whereby Tehran will be able to supply weapons to its allies in the region. Although these reports have not been verified, such an agreement will certainly anger Iran's #1 enemy.
If even after these unequivocal calls for the destruction of Israel and America, the negotiators' concessions continue, it would appear that there are those who are willing to make a deal at any price, and there is no way nor will to avoid this bad deal.
Despite objections from a host of players who are committed to scuttling this long overdue process, there is a good chance for the 2 sides to finally bridge the gap, shake hands and make history.
Let's get some more perspective on all of this now, and for that we can turn to Nader Barezadeh. He's a professor at the University of California, Irvine, and in New York we cross to Maupin, Celab Maupin rather. He's a youth organizer at the International Action Center. He's joining us from New York there. Maupin, if I can start with you there, we're hearing a lot less about differences in Vienna these days. Are you confident that we're going to see some kind of a deal emerge out of this?
Well, if a deal is signed, that will be the result of the popular will of people in the United States, people in Iran, and people all over the world. Continued sanctions on Iran and continued hostility between Iran and the United States are not in anyone's interest. People here in the U.S. Who are suffering, and it's supposedly an economic recovery, but millions of young people don't have jobs. Millions of young people are facing student debt. It's not in their interest to continue hostility with Iran. The forces that want to prevent this deal from being signed are really, I've been calling them the triangle of evil. It's the oil companies, the weapons manufacturers, and the Israeli government and its network of supporters. These are very, very wealthy interests here in the United States. They don't want there to be any deal that is signed. But other than that, the majority of humanity is against them, and they want there to be peace and cooperation between the United States and Iran.
Now that, if I can cross over to you, what would you say are the most important issues in these talks?
I think the most important issue is, besides all the things that we already know, is that how is Iran going to continue with its peaceful research and development in some of these nuclear technologies? I think that is the most important sticky point. It's been dragging on for days already. And I think the proposal from the West is for 15 years of halt. And the red line that the Iranian leadership put forward was less than 10 years. And the amount of R&D they can do, that is going to basically kill Iran's nuclear program if there is very limited R&D. And there are several governments that do not want to see that. So if they can resolve that, I think all the other issues have a solution, including sales of military equipment and ballistic missiles. They can do that probably in a staggered way. And also, I just disagree with your other guest. The weapon manufacturers would love to see this go forward, because there will be more reason to sell more weapons to both sides. So in a way, that's why the Russians were all in favor of the military sanctions removal, and to some extent, the West and U.S. would love to supply the other side, the Persian Gulf states and Israel with additional weapons. So I think from that point of view, unfortunately, they're on the same page.
Yeah, Saleb, and we do know that the Americans they've come out and they've said that if this deal does go through, that would open up the market among the Persian Gulf monarchies and Israel for weapons sales.
Yes, however, the important thing to keep in mind is that Iran is a source of stability throughout the region. While Saudi-backed forces, Takfiris throughout the region, are pushing for sectarian warfare between Sunnis and Shias, Iran is calling for an end to sectarian violence. In Syria, in Iraq, they're doing everything they can to bring together religious and different ethnic groups. And if Iran gets stronger as a result of the sanctions being lifted, this would further their agenda of creating peace throughout the region, which is the opposite of what the United States, Saudi Arabia, and Israel are pushing for as they continue to escalate sectarian violence and killing in the region. Strengthening Iran, lifting the sanctions, that would result in a huge boom in sales of Iranian oil on the international markets. Iranian oil exports would increase, and that would be good for Iran. However, it would be bad for Saudi Arabia, it would be bad for the United States because the price of the oil that they're selling would decrease with the rise of oil on the markets. The price of oil is already low as a result of that. And, already the U.S. government and U.S. weapons manufacturers are the primary supplier of weapons to the region. The Saudi military now has the fourth largest military budget of any country in the world, and their weapons are purchased almost exclusively from the United States at this point. And those weapons are going to Syria, where they're in the hands of Takfiri extremists. They're going to Iraq, where they're in the hands of Sunni extremists who want to kill Shia. Everywhere the U.S. weapons are flowing throughout the region, they're spreading sectarianism. Whereas, Iran, historically, Iran's role in the region right now is to promote peace between different ethnic groups. In Syria, they're supporting a secular government in which Christians, Alawites, and Sunnis are living in peace with each other. And that's the opposite of the goal that the Israelis have. If you look at the Oded Yanan plan that was published in the 1980s, really the foreign policy strategy of the Israelis is for sectarian war. They want Sunnis killing Shias, they want Kurds fighting everyone else, they want different ethnic groups killing each other so that the region can be divided and that there can't be any then stable opposition to Israel. What they're the most afraid of is the peoples throughout the Middle East coming together despite their religious and ethnic differences and opposing Israel. That would spell the end of Israel, and they know that. They want to further sectarian and religious differences throughout the region, and strengthening Iran would be a blow to that strategy.
Yeah, and when we look at some of the obstacles to this deal, now that we, of course, have the Israeli influence, even though they're not part of the talks directly, trying to convince their allies in both the U.S. and Europe not to sign on to an agreement.
That's correct.
Yeah, Nader, go ahead.
Yes, that is correct. Even if the agreement is signed and the major issue that I mentioned about R&D is resolved, there's still the Republicans in the U.S. Senate. They will vote everything that Mr. Obama puts forward on domestic and international. We've seen that over and over. The only Trans-Pacific Agreement was the only thing that they supported in the past couple of years that I've been watching. So you can bet for sure that the Republicans, or majority of them, will vote against this, regardless of what it is. What's left is those Democratic senators that are in favor of supporting Israel under any agreement. If they switch side and vote for the same as the Republicans, then they get close to the 2/3 votes, veto-proof approach for the Mr. Obama. So Mr. Obama's work is really set up for him. After the agreement, he has to work really hard to get those Democrats not to vote the same as the Republicans. Because if they do, there will be a major embarrassment for the U.S. foreign policy since Mr. Kerry signed an agreement, but the U.S. government cannot pass it through.
Yeah, and Saleb, we've heard time and time again that the White House cannot really make any decisions without bringing this back to a number of other interested parties. Even if an agreement is signed, as Nader was saying there, then the White House is in for quite a battle to get Congress to sign off on it.
Well, absolutely. A couple months ago, we saw something unprecedented in U.S. history. Never before have members of Congress invited the leader of a foreign government to the United States to give a speech criticizing and attacking a sitting president. That is a phenomenon that is completely unfamiliar. And when that took place, when Netanyahu came to the U.S. Congress and gave a speech denouncing Obama's plans for negotiations with Iran, When that took place, Israel basically solidified its relationship with the extreme fringe of the Republican Party, the Tea Party elements. And by doing that, Israel essentially alienated itself from millions of people in the United States who don't like the Tea Party and don't like the extreme fringe of the Republican Party and don't support them. And in doing that, Israel kind of positioned itself within U.S. politics, and it did so in a rather unstrategic way. It basically aligned itself with a section of the U.S. political establishment that is increasingly unpopular and is extremely polarizing. So that there's a reason that a number of Israeli generals denounced Netanyahu for doing it, because it essentially opened millions of Obama supporters up to a much friendlier attitude toward Iran and a much more hostile attitude to Israel. The reality of the situation is, though, that the Republicans and a lot of Democrats who are aligned with the American-Israeli Public Affairs Committee, as well as the oil companies and weapons manufacturers, a lot of Democrats, could vote against this deal also. So I'm hoping personally that John Kerry will remember where he came from. John Kerry's political career began as a protester. He came back from Vietnam, from the Vietnam War, and like millions of Americans, he protested the Vietnam War. He marched in the streets and he denounced that war as a veteran, saying that it wasn't right. And he stood up to the oil companies and the weapons manufacturers. And I'm hoping that he'll do the same and that the result will be a deal that lifts the sanctions on Iran. However, even if a deal is signed, it will still be, the Congress will still have the ability to overturn it. So we'll only have to see what happens. I mean, the issue at hand here is, does Iran have the right to exist? Does it have the right to exist and to, practice what is its right under the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, which is peaceful nuclear energy? All rational human beings would say that Iran does have the right to do that. Iran does have the right to have an Islamic republic or any other form of government that they choose. However, these wealthy and powerful entities that I named, they don't agree with that. So we'll see if the will of the people and the will of reason, triumphs over the forces of greed and profits.
Yeah, that still remains to be seen. Okay, we are going to have to leave it there. I want to thank both of my guests, Nader Baherzadeh in Tokyo and Saleb Maupin in New York. Thanks very much for your time, gentlemen. Well, it's been more than 2 days since a UN-brokered humanitarian truce was declared in Yemen, but that hasn't stopped the relentless Saudi bombardment. Over 24 people have been killed in the last 48 hours alone. Now, to make matters worse, Yemen's medical services are grinding to a halt across much of the country.
110 days. That's how long Saudi Arabia has been bombing its neighbor, Yemen. Saudi fighter jets have claimed the lives of at least 21 civilians in the capital Sana'a on Monday morning, 2 days after a United Nations brokered humanitarian truce was supposed to go into effect. An orphanage in the northwestern city of Harad was also targeted by the Saudis later in the day.
They killed my brother and my sister and her son. This is tragic. How is any of this their fault? They killed my brother's wife and his son. How is this the children's fault?
Just after midnight, they hit us with one missile. They hit a house which was completely destroyed with the family inside. The houses of my cousin, sister, and niece were hit. 10 houses were struck, and there's nothing left. My sister's children are still missing. They were in this house, and it's been completely demolished.
We hope that there will be a collective human conscience to stop these crimes against civilians.
Many are now questioning on what basis the United Nations declared its truce, which was due to last throughout the last week of the holy month of Ramadan. The UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon is expressing disappointment.
The General is very, very much disappointed that the humanitarian pause did not take hold over the weekend in Yemen. We are continuing with contacts at various levels. Despite the continued airstrikes, despite the fighting, our humanitarian colleagues and their partners were able to distribute some vital aid to the desperate people of Yemen wherever they can and however they can. Obviously, the security situation makes it that much more difficult for humanitarian aid, for critical humanitarian aid to be delivered.
Amplifying an existing humanitarian crisis, medical services have ground to a halt in 11 provinces due to lack of fuel and medical supplies. Saudi warplanes have been indiscriminately targeting residential areas as well as medical facilities across the impoverished country. By some estimates, over 4,000 people have been killed as a result of that Saudi-led bombing campaign. Roughly half of those killed were civilians, according to the United Nations.
You're watching Al-Etejad English News, still to come on the program. Greece and the EU clinch a deal, but no one in Athens is celebrating. We'll tell you more after the break. Human rights group has slammed an Israeli commander for killing a Palestinian youth, calling his actions counter to basic human morality. This video released by the group shows the moment 17-year-old Mohammed Ali Kozba threw a stone at an Israeli commander's car. He's then shot in the back 3 times while fleeing the scene. Now, that pursuit and the shooting weren't captured by this CCTV footage, but the Israeli commander is said to have moved the teenager off the road after having shot him before getting back in his car and driving off. Well, by most accounts, Greece has surrendered much of its sovereignty to outside supervision in return for a $95 billion bailout to keep the near-bankrupt country in the Eurozone. The Greek Prime Minister has accepted a wide range of reforms, including pension cuts and tax hikes, just a week after Greeks rejected a similar proposal through a referendum. On Monday, Alexis Tsipras returned to Athens to begin the political wrangling in order to get approval for his deal with Greece's international creditors. Facing a Wednesday deadline, he can put all of the required measures in one parliamentary bill. Aside from ordinary Greeks, he's also facing opposition within his own ruling party. Now, in Europe, the deal is being portrayed as a step in the right direction.
I think we've found ways where the advantages outweigh the disadvantages. The basic principles which we always followed to rescue the euro are there, namely on the one side solidarity among member countries and on the other side the responsibility of the country where changes need to take place.
Today was a long negotiation, but above all a historic decision, because if Greece had left the Eurozone, what would have been said? That the Eurozone wasn't able to ensure its integrity and solidarity? The Eurozone would have gone backwards when it needs to go forwards to carry a project that protects people because the euro protects.
Without doubt, we have the feeling that it's a first step to rebuild growth. Now we have to implement the measures and continue with the steps.
Relief in Brussels, but in Athens the mood is anything but. Their banks still closed. Many fear there is only worse to come.
Is it for the Greek people or against the Greek people? Because everything done so far has been against the Greek people.
I found out that the agreement has been reached, but what the measures will be is another matter altogether. Foreigners will skin us alive.
Another who might be fearing for his own skin is Alexis Tsipras. Emerging from the talks, The Greek Prime Minister was quick to paint the deal as a victory.
Today's agreement keeps Greece in a state of financial stability. It gives the possibilities for a recovery.
But he faces a tough sell. Greece has already had 2 bailouts, and a third will mean yet more austerity. Tough on the people and the economy, says BGC Partners Mike Ingram.
It's extremely unlikely, given the sort of extreme economic stress that the Greek economy is already in, and the debt that it's being asked to service, that the outlook for Greece is anything other than one of economic depression.
Despite that, the reforms are expected to pass through Parliament. It gave its initial approval to the measures on Saturday before the talks began. The government's future, though, is nowhere near as secure. Having campaigned for a no vote in last week's referendum, Tsipras is being seen by some as a sellout, including from within his own party. His Labour minister denounced the deal on state TV, even before the full terms were confirmed.
It's very likely that we'll see Syriza splinter further. It is, at the end of the day, a coalition of far-left political parties. So you'd have to say, well, the days of the Syriza government seem to be quite limited, and I would fully expect there to be an election in Greece in the autumn.
The last time Greeks went to the polls, they voted against the terms of another bailout. In the home of democracy, many will surely now feel cheated.
Patrick Young is the CEO at Hansa Trade, and he's also advisor to global fund managers. Patrick, I guess it's safe to say that Greek austerity is here to stay.
Absolutely. In fact, what we've seen is the most incredible week. A week ago, the Greeks rejected the notion of austerity. A week later, we have Prime Minister Tsipras agreeing the outline of a deal, a framework that's actually much, much worse and has much greater austerity than anything we've seen before.
Where will this leave the country, which has already been devastated by cuts and austerity, Patrick?
The problem actually is this agreement is ultimately unworkable. Even if they manage to get the rubber stamp of the Parliament this week, even if we don't see mass outbreaks of all sorts of protests and so on getting onto the streets, the danger is that this just cannot hold together. The ultimate agreement that has been made so far is simply a horribly ruthless imperial victor's justice brought by the Western powers against Mr. Tsipras for having the temerity to call a referendum and call their bluff in the first place. In truth, this arrangement is nothing more than duct tape trying to hold together a single currency that is going to break up sooner or later.
Patrick Young there, thank you very much for your time. And now a recap of our top stories. Iraq security forces announced the start of a new operation to take the country's western province of Anbar. Taking on in the P5+1 group inch closer towards a historic agreement, with Iran's foreign minister expressing optimism over a nuclear deal by Tuesday. And health services across Yemen are collapsing amid a relentless Saudi bombing campaign. That's all for me and the Al-Etejad English News team. Thanks for watching.